The day my son called to tell me he'd gotten married, he led with the cottage. Not the wedding, the cottage. The first thing out of his mouth was, "Hey Dad, how are things up there?" And I told him the dock needed new decking, that the pump had been acting up, that the loons were late this year. We talked about the lake for 3 minutes before he said, almost as an aside, "Oh, so actually, there's something I wanted to tell you. We got married last Saturday, small ceremony down in Niagara-on-the-Lake, just her family and a couple of friends. Very low-key, didn't want any fuss." I opened my mouth and closed it again. "Anyway," he said, "we were thinking we'd head up to the lake for a few nights for a little honeymoon. Nothing fancy. Would you be able to drop a key in the mail?" I told him I'd take care of it. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, my coffee going cold, looking out at the backyard, where Joan's garden had gone wild since she passed. 3 years, and I still hadn't fixed the fence she'd been asking me to replace. I don't know why I thought about that then. Maybe because the cottage had been her idea. The whole thing, every nail, every board, every summer morning drinking tea on the dock while the mist came off the lake. It was hers as much as it was mine, and now our son had gotten married without telling me, and was asking to use it for a honeymoon. 3 days later, I drove 2.5 hours down to Toronto and left something outside his condo door. I didn't knock, didn't call ahead. I drove home, put on the kettle, and waited. By that evening, my daughter-in-law had stopped answering her phone. By the next morning, she was gone. My name is Alvin Mercer. I'm 63 years old, a retired civil engineer from Barrie, Ontario, and I want to tell you that I am not, by nature, a man who makes dramatic gestures. For 32 years, I built bridges and overpasses and culverts for the Ministry of Transportation. I read load specifications. I reviewed soil reports. I am a patient man who moves slowly and gets things right. So when I tell you that the thing I left outside my son's door changed all of our lives, I want you to understand that it wasn't done in anger. It was done because I had spent 6 months being careful, and careful had finally run out. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My son is 31 years old. He grew up in Barrie, played hockey badly, and loved it anyway. Got a business degree from Queen's, and now works in corporate finance in the financial district. He's methodical, precise. More like me than either of us would have admitted when he was a teenager. After Joan died, we developed a rhythm. Sunday calls, usually an hour, talking about nothing much in the way men do when they're grieving, but won't say so. He came up to the cottage every August. Sometimes we fished, sometimes we just sat on the dock. It was enough. He met his wife about 18 months ago at a professional development event downtown. He told me about her on a Sunday call, his voice different, lighter, more careful. "She's in financial consulting," he said. "She's sharp, Dad. I think you'd like her." I told him to bring her up sometime. She came in November. I made a proper roast. I dusted off Joan's good dishes. I was nervous in the way you get when something matters, when you want to make someone feel welcome in your home. She was 29, well-dressed in the careful way that suggests money or the careful performance of money. Firm handshake, good eye contact, all the right questions about my career, my retirement, my health. I thought she was charming. I thought my son had done well. The cottage came up twice, before we'd even started the soup. She'd seen photos on the bookshelf. Joan and me on the dock, my son at maybe 10 years old, holding up a smallmouth bass he'd caught and was extremely proud of. She picked up that photo and looked at it for a moment. "This is the Muskoka property?" she said. "Not the cottage. Not your place at the lake, the Muskoka property." "Muskoka adjacent," I said, "about 40 minutes north. We've had it since '97. "Lakefront?" "Yes." "Those values have held up remarkably well," she said, "even with what happened to the market in 2020. Waterfront in that corridor is almost recession-proof at this point." I said something like, "I suppose that's true," and handed her a bread roll. By dessert, she had asked about the dock, the square footage, whether I'd considered short-term vacation rentals, and what my long-term plans for the property were. I answered each question patiently. My son was smiling in the way people smile when they're proud of their partner and trying not to show it too obviously. I told myself she was just curious, making conversation. That night, after I'd washed the dishes, I stood at the kitchen window, looking out at Joan's garden, and I tried to remember if I'd felt anything similar the first time I met Joan's parents. I couldn't. But Joan's father had asked me about my intentions, not our property values. Over the following months, I noticed my son less. The Sunday calls shortened. First to 45 minutes, then 30, then occasional texts instead. Something he'd never done before. He missed my birthday dinner. He came for Christmas but left early. His wife hadn't been feeling well. She never came back to Barry. I understood that people build new lives when they fall in love. I tried not to make it a thing. Then he got engaged. I found out from LinkedIn. He'd updated his bio, excited to be getting married this spring. I saw it on a Tuesday morning over my coffee and sat there for a while with my phone in my hand. When I called him, he was breezy about it. "Sorry, Dad, I kept meaning to call. You know how it is?" I asked when they were celebrating. He mentioned an engagement dinner the following weekend. Her family's tradition, just her side. I said that was fine. It wasn't fine, but what was I going to do? A few weeks later, they came up to Barry. Not to the cottage, just to the house for lunch, briefly. She was pleasant. She helped clear the plates. And then, while my son was in the bathroom, she asked me very directly whether I'd had the cottage appraised recently, whether I'd updated my will since Joan passed, and whether I'd ever considered putting the property into a family trust. I'm an engineer. I notice when someone is working through a checklist. "Not recently," I said. "Is there a reason you're asking?" She smiled. "Just curious. These things matter when you're starting a family." That September, my son called to introduce the concept of healthy distance. He didn't call it that. He called it building their own foundation as a couple. But I recognized what I was hearing. His wife had been reading about emotional over-reliance. He'd been depending on me too much, using me as a sounding board when he should be turning to her. It might be better to speak less frequently, give them space to grow as a unit. Could I understand that? I told him I could understand it. That was the 4th Sunday in a row he hadn't called. I sat in the chair where Joan used to read, and I thought about the way he'd said, "she thinks," before every other sentence. I thought about the woman who'd called the cottage, the Muskoka property, on the night she met me. I thought about the checklist questions over the cleared lunch plates. And then the call came. I was up on the back step cleaning out the eave strews on a Thursday afternoon in October when my phone rang. My son. I propped myself against the downspout and answered. We talked about the weather for 2 minutes. Then, "So I wanted to give you a heads up. We actually got married last weekend." A pause. Small ceremony at a winery in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Very intimate. Just her family and a couple of close friends. I want to be honest with you. I knew, in some way, that something like this was coming. I could feel it in the shortening calls, in the missed Christmas, in the questions at the lunch table. I knew, and it still knocked the air out of me. "Congratulations," I said. "Thanks, Dad. So, the other thing is, we were thinking we'd head up to the cottage for a few nights. Kind of a honeymoon situation. Nothing too long. Could you get me a copy of the key?" I looked out at the neighbor's oak tree losing its leaves onto my driveway. "Sure," I said. "I'll sort it out." "Great. You're the best." He hung up. I climbed down from the step. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table, and I didn't move for a long time. Here is the thing about grief that nobody tells you. It doesn't make you soft. It makes you good at sitting with difficult things. 32 years of engineering taught me that the worst thing you can do in a crisis is react before you understand what you're actually looking at. So I sat, I thought, and after about an hour I picked up the phone and called an old colleague named Vern. a fellow who'd spent 20 years doing fraud investigations for an insurance firm before he retired. We'd kept in touch. I told him I needed a quiet background check on my new daughter-in-law. I told him something felt wrong, and I needed to understand what I was looking at before I did anything. I couldn't take back. "How wrong?" he said. "I'm not sure yet," I said. "That's the problem." He told me to give him 2 weeks. I kept contact with my son in the meantime. Pleasant calls. I asked about the new place, whether the commute was manageable, whether they'd thought about the holidays. I didn't mention the wedding. I didn't push. Civil engineers are patient. We wait for the data. Vern called on a Wednesday and asked me to meet him at a diner off the 26th, about 20 minutes south of town. When I got there, he had a folder on the table and a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, which told me everything about the mood before he said a word. "Your daughter-in-law was previously engaged," he said, twice. The first time was 2018. A man in Hamilton whose family owned a farm property outside the city. Heritage designation, good acreage, significant land value. The engagement lasted 8 months. It ended when his sister hired someone to run a background check and found that the woman had already consulted a property lawyer about the land 3 months into the relationship. When confronted, she left overnight. The second time was 2021. A man in Victoria whose family had a waterfront house on the Saanich Inlet. His father passed away midway through the engagement and left the property to him. She had already spoken to a real estate agent about comparable sales in the area. He found the correspondence. The engagement ended. 2 is a pattern, Vern said. "What does she actually do?" I asked. "For work?" He slid a page across the table. Financial consulting, nominally. A numbered company registered in Ontario. No employees, minimal filings, no verifiable clients. "It's a shell," he said. "She presents well, sounds credible, but there's nothing behind it." I looked at the documents. I thought about the woman at my roast dinner asking about property trusts while my son was in the bathroom. "Is there anything else?" I asked, because there was always something else. Vern set one more page on top of the others and placed it carefully, the way you set something down when you want the other person to have a moment before they read it. Her father. He'd presented himself as a retired businessman from the Ottawa Valley. Respectable. He'd been on a conference call with my son and me after the engagement was announced. Warm and easy on the phone, told me he was glad his daughter had found someone so grounded. What Vern had found, buried in Ontario civil court filings from 1999, was a property dispute connected to Joan's family estate. Joan's parents had been in a small commercial development partnership with a man who had quietly transferred assets out of their joint company and dissolved the partnership before disappearing. The case had been partially resolved, but a portion of the claim, roughly $280,000, had never been recovered because the other party's assets couldn't be fully traced. That other party's name appeared in documents connected to my daughter-in-law's father. Not directly, through a numbered holding company since dissolved, of which her father had been a director. Vern watched me read through it twice. "The estate claim passed to Joan," he said, "and then to you, and theoretically to your son." I set the papers down flat on the table. "She didn't happen to fall for my son," I said. "No," said Vern, "I don't think she did." I drove home, made dinner, stood in Joan's garden in the dark for a while, which is something I do when I need to think. Then I went to the spare room where I keep my woodworking tools and my good stationery, and I spent the rest of the evening putting together what I was going to leave at their door. I found a flat-bottomed wooden box I'd made some years ago. Maple, sanded smooth, the kind of thing that looks like a keepsake. I lined it with tissue paper. Inside I placed a leather document folder. The folder contained everything Vern had compiled, the background reports on both previous engagements, the court filings from Joan's family estate case, the corporate records connecting her father to the dissolved holding company, and a one-page summary prepared by the estate lawyer who had been managing Joan's unresolved claim for 4 years. I included the lawyer's contact card. I included a note that said simply, "Every family has a history. Now you know yours. With love, Dad." I drove to Toronto early Sunday morning. Found parking, took the elevator to their floor, set the box outside their door, and left. I was back on the 400 heading north before 9 o'clock. I stopped at a Tim Hortons outside Barrie and had a coffee and a breakfast sandwich. And I sat in the parking lot watching the highway traffic, and I felt, for the first time in months, like I could breathe properly. My phone rang at 2 in the afternoon. My son's number, but her voice, very calm. "Alvin," she said, "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "Has there?" I said. She started to say something else. I heard my son's voice in the background, low at first, then not low at all. Then she stopped, speaking mid-sentence. Then my son picked up. "Dad," his voice was flat in a way I hadn't heard before. "What is this?" "It's a wedding gift," I said. "Read everything in the folder. Then call me." He called 4 hours later. He was quieter than I'd ever heard him. "She locked herself in the bedroom," he said. "She won't come out." A pause. "Dad, the Hamilton situation, is that confirmed?" "Vern put his name on the report. He stands behind all of it." "And the court filings, the money from Mum's parents." "Your mother's family was cheated in a business deal a long time ago, and it was never fully settled. The estate lawyer's name is in the folder. She's been managing the claim for years, and she can walk you through what I can't." My son went quiet. "I found something," he said after a moment, "on her laptop. She'd left it open." I waited. "There are emails going back almost 2 years before we met." His voice had gone very careful, the way voices get when a person is holding themselves very still. "Her father found the estate filing through a public registry search. He cross-referenced it with Mum's death records. He found me." A pause. She texted him from the parking garage the night of the event where we met. She said, "Made contact. He's interested. This could work." The line was quiet. "She drove to that event with her father," my son said. "He dropped her off." I heard him exhale, long and slow, the way you breathe out when something enormous has just settled into place. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm sorry I didn't find this sooner." "Don't," he said. "That's not on you." He came to Barrie that night. I heard his car in the driveway just after 11. When I opened the door, he was standing on the porch with his hands jammed in his jacket pockets, and he looked exactly the way he'd looked at 14, when he'd put a hockey puck through the garage window and come to tell me. Scared and tired and not quite able to meet my eyes, I stepped aside and let him in. We sat at the kitchen table until almost 2 in the morning. He'd gone through her emails after we'd spoken. Not all of them, but enough. The correspondence between her and her father went back 22 months, beginning before my son had any idea she existed. Her father had identified the unresolved estate claim through a public search. He'd traced it to Joan, then to me, then to my son. He'd found the cottage in property records. He'd built a picture of our family from public documents and told his daughter where to be and who to find. She had been engaged twice before, and both times it had unraveled too quickly. The third time she'd been more patient, more methodical. She'd spent 14 months establishing trust before the wedding. "She asked me once why I was so close to you," my son said, looking at his hands on the table. "I told her it was because Mum died. She nodded and said that made sense, and that we'd build our own traditions as a couple." He shook his head slowly. "I thought she was being mature." I put my hand on his shoulder for a moment and then took it away. "She was very good at this," I said. "That's exactly the point. This is what she does." "The cottage," he said. "I know. She wanted to get me up there alone, get me talking about the estate, get a foothold on the property, establish regular use, the marriage certificate, build a position to negotiate from." "That's what the estate lawyer thinks too," I said. He was quiet for a long moment. "She asked me twice whether you'd updated your will," he said. "I know," I said. "My daughter-in-law left within the week. No confrontation, no scene. She packed while my son was at work and sent a 2-line text saying she needed space and would be in touch through her lawyer. She wasn't. The estate lawyer reached out to my son 3 weeks later with documentation that gave him what he needed to begin annulment proceedings on grounds of misrepresentation. The process is underway. Her father called me once, about 10 days after she left, introducing himself as though we'd never spoken before, suggesting there had been some confusion, hoping we could talk directly, one man to another. I told him I'd have Donna call him. He didn't phone back. The estate claim is in process. These things take time, but it exists, and it has legs, and Donna says sometimes they surprise you. That's not the ending, though. That's not the part I keep returning to. The ending is a Saturday morning in early September, about 6 weeks after everything fell apart. My son drove up the night before and slept in his old room. First time he'd done that in years. In the morning, we drove up to the cottage together. The road through the trees, the smell of the lake when you open, the car door, the sound of water against the dock pilings that is different from every other sound I know. We sat in the Muskoka chairs on the dock with our coffee, and we didn't say much, cool enough to see our breath. The lake was flat and gray-silver. Something was moving far out near the opposite shore. After a while, my son said, "I'm sorry I didn't invite you to the wedding." I looked at the water. "I think I knew something wasn't right," he said. "I think I knew from fairly early on, and I didn't want anyone around who might say something I'd actually have to hear." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "That's not an excuse. I just want you to know what it was." I thought about that for a moment. "Your mother," I said, "would have known the first time she asked about the property values." He made a sound, half a laugh, real and surprised. "Yeah," he said, "she would have had her pegged by the soup course." "Absolutely by the soup course." He smiled. It was the first real one I'd seen from him in weeks, and it looked exactly like Joan's. We fished for a couple of hours after that. Didn't catch anything worth keeping. It didn't matter. The lake did what it always does, which is sit there being enormous and indifferent and quietly beautiful, and after a while that starts to feel like enough. On the way back to the car, my son stopped at the end of the dock and stood looking out at the water for a moment. "That was some wedding gift, Dad," he said. I picked up the tackle box. "The best gifts," I told him, "are the ones that stay with you." He nodded once, slowly, and we walked back up through the trees together.